Okay. So, first question is, did anybody have any questions on what we went over last class? Is everything going fairly well? Does anybody want me to go back over something we showed last class? Okay, all right. Secondly, um, and okay, so I wanted to just talk, since we are now dealing with blocks of copy instead of just single words. About some of the controls we have for type. Let's see. So there are four aspects to type. We have its physical size and proportion. We have kerning and tracking. We have leading, and we have the number of characters in a line. All except the last are use a unit of measure called picas and points. Okay, so picas, points are 1/6 of an inch. Picas are 1/6 of an inch. So there are 6 units per inch. Then points are 1/72 of an inch. Now, my first question is, why would we have a unit of measure like picas and points when we're using it for measuring type? Anybody have an idea? I'm sorry, could you? Well, not exactly. So if we measure, so how big is type? It's pretty small sometimes, right? And if we were using inches to measure that type, it would be kind of difficult, right? Like the fractions that get to be really out of control. So we use picas and points because the type is really small. And if we have a unit of measure called a point, and it's 1/72 of an inch, most of the time we can measure things in whole units. So type is like 8 points large or 12 points large instead of being 1.0625 or something like that. Okay, so we use points because it's really easy to measure type using that kind of unit. And we use picas. I don't know. I don't actually know exactly why we have picas, but it ends up being that picas are a really nice measurement. when you look at this magazine spread you're designing, the distance between columns of type is 1 pica. And it looks good. So I think picas have stuck because it tends to agree well with the way we design things with type. Okay. So sometimes, if you're adding 1 pica and 3 picas, that would be 4 picas. If you're adding 1 point and 12 points, that would be 13 points, like that. But sometimes we mix these numbers. Sometimes we use the mix. It's usually written out as 1 pica, 6 points, like this. So those of you who can't see so well, 1p6. And then if we go to add these, okay, how many people in here actually remember what a base 12 set of numbers, what base 12 is in math? I know you all had it at some point in your math history. So base 12 means that you count all the way up to 12, and at 12 it also is the same as 1. So anyway, here, let me just run through this. So if we have a series of mixed units, what you would do is you would add the points first. So in this case, it would be 6 plus 6 plus 2, which is 14, right? Okay. So 14. And then you'd add the picas. So 1 plus 3 plus 2 would be 6 picas. So it'd be 6p14. Or since it's base 12, you could divide 14 by 12, which you get 1 remainder of 2, right? Does that kind of vaguely sound familiar? And then you would add the 1 to the pica side and the 2 remaining to the point side, like that. Make sense? Okay. So anyway. And again, we use this unit of measurement. Picas and points have been used to measure type since the mid-1700s. Prior to that, there was no standardized unit of measure for type, and the type from one type foundry and type from another type foundry wasn't interchangeable. So, which made things complicated. Just as an aside, back before we had computers on our desktop, a pica was actually not exactly an inch. It was like an inch and a tiny fraction. But when computers came in and they started doing all this design on your laptop, they or desktops at that point, the makers of the digital program said, this is ridiculous. Why isn't this a solid inch? And then they just adjusted everything. So originally, when type was made out of metal, the type size was measured by the size of the block of lead that the font was molded to. And your ascenders and your descenders all had to fit on that block for it to be uniform. And the sizes that you see when you go to pick measurements of type on the computer are the sizes, the standard sizes that type used to be made in, like 24 point, 36 point, 48 point, and so on. they didn't have like, when it was made out of lead, they didn't have like 47-point type, even if you needed it. Let me jump past that. So just to be aware, just because a piece of type fits on a, say, 60-point block of lead doesn't mean that the type is the same size. Okay, all of these typefaces here are 60-point, but you can see that the script face is much smaller. Helvetica is much bigger. So if you're working on a design and you decide to change your typeface, there are probably all kinds of other adjustments you may need to make when you make that change, because type is not sized. 60-point does not mean it's a specific size. It means it's, it just means that the ascenders and the descenders all fit within 60 points. And something like a script font might have like huge, what are called swashes. The Y might come way down like that, and that would all have to fit on your 60 points. So the type is going to be smaller. Let's see, when you're working with type, there's also something called the X height. So which is the height of the lowercase x. If you look at Adobe Jensen Pro, which is an old style font, the size of the X is relatively small compared to the capital letter, while a font like Georgia, which is a newer font, has a very large X relative to your cap height. And you can see, if you look at this, even though these are both 60-point, that Georgia looks a lot larger than Jensen, because this X height is so much taller. Does that make sense? Okay, and then this is what it looks like when it's typeset. This is Adobe Jensen 14-point. Notice how much white space there seems to be between the type, but it's a lot smaller, while Georgia at 14-point with the same leading is a lot darker, and it's also seems a lot larger. Okay. So when you're picking fonts, sometimes you want it to look neater and cleaner and more open, and sometimes you just want it to be larger so it's easier to read. When we measure type, these are some of the things that we measure, and these things are all adjustable. I mean, you could have this font and have the descender height be down here, and that could extend down there. Or you could have a really short descender and it could be up here. You can have this X height be high. You can have the X height lower. You could have the X height even higher than this. So these are all adjustable, and they contribute to what the font looks like. How it looks on a page. For instance, currently the style tends to be to make the X height larger and the descenders kind of short, so that you can just get more, so that the face is just bigger to read on the page. Okay, tracking and kerning. So we talked about this a little bit. So you have a font, it has a certain standard tracking that's built into it, and that's adjustable. You can make the type widen the type out. You can tighten the tracking. If a font is designed to be used really small, like in body text, like you're doing for your magazine article, if it's designed for that size, and a lot of fonts are designed to be used small, when you enlarge them, it tends to enlarge the spaces. The spaces also get enlarged when you blow it up. So if you take a body font that's intended to be used small and you use it for a headline, it tends to open up the spaces between the characters. And then we want to track it in and tighten it up because it's going to look better as a headline if it's tracked in. Okay. So. And also, if you had a font that's designed for a headline and you use it really small, then you might want to open up the tracking so that the characters are easier to see and they don't run into each other so much. So design-wise, we try not to track lowercase letters out like this. I mean, it does happen. People can do it. We tend not to as much because it tends to be harder to have it look like a word, and it tends to break apart into just individual letters. While if you use all caps like this, because there's a nice straight line underneath it and on the top, tracking the letters out like this is generally reads better. It's more acceptable, and you'll see this in logos for companies, for instance. We talked a little bit about kerning, and so just as a review, so kerning is particularly important when we're dealing with large type like headlines. When we're dealing with body text, it's generally the changes, the differences are so small that they're kind of not worth bothering with. Sometimes you'll run across a font that's really badly kerned, and then and then you actually need to do something about it, but usually you don't. And fonts straight out of the box, if they're well-made fonts, say Adobe brand fonts, or the two guys in the Helvetica movie, Hoffler and Ferrer Jones, their type right out of the box is probably not going to need a lot of kerning. But if you have a font that maybe isn't so well made or just seems to be sort of irregular, if you go from the metrics, which is the default, to optical, select your headline, change it to optical, it'll clean up some of the kerning, and then you can go back in and hand kern if there's something that you just think is still really bad. And it will particularly end up being like where you have capital letters running into lowercase letters. That's probably the point where you're going to have the most trouble. Okay, blocks of type. Okay. So, as I was saying last class, here, I'm just going to pass this around. This is the difference. One of these shows the default size for body copy and in InDesign, and then this is what I had you change it to. So you can see what the difference is. What I highly recommend is when you're designing, so designing something for the web is a different creature because people are looking at it on their computer screens. But when you're designing something that's going to be printed, it's actually going to be printed at an actual size. And so I highly recommend that when you're designing, that you take and you print out what you're designing so you can see what it really looks like at the actual size it's going to be printed. As I was saying, what you've designed, your 8.5 by 11 page, your screen is probably not showing you the page at the actual size. It's probably showing it a little reduced. And so you'll try to make the type look good on that slightly reduced page. And then when you print it out, it increases and it might not be what you're looking for. Does it make sense? So when you're doing print, particularly if you're doing something small like a business card that you're going to like blow up like crazy when you're looking at it on the screen, it's really super important to print it out to see what it looks like. Given that this is the default for InDesign, these are some standard sizes that you would actually want to use when you're starting to design something. So print, when you're designing something like a brochure or a magazine, then generally I would start out around 10 on 12 point leading, 10 point size, 12 point leading. If you're doing PDFs that are going to be viewed on the web, 12 points on 14.4, which is the default, looks fine. People are going to be looking at that PDF on your computer screen, and making it a little bigger is a good thing. If you're dealing with web pages, the standard size for type on a web page is 16 pixels. And so this is about correct. And they use a slightly different terminology when you're coding for the web, using something called line height. And then if you're doing something as small as a business card, then you might want to start off with like type that's 9 points on 11. So I would probably write these down and keep these handy, and it will just give you a sort of a set of numbers to go from when you start designing something. On a Mac, they are the same because it's 72 pixels to an inch on a Mac for a standard web site. So yes, and I suspect but I think it's 96 pixels to an inch on a PC. So the web is just kind of this other different entity. I can't really explain it well enough to explain it actually. Because the thing is with websites, you can zoom in and you can zoom out. And there's all this stuff going on. And we try not to do, if you're designing something for the web, you try not to actually use standard size, pixel sizes, because then it can interfere with zooming in and zooming out. And anyway, lots of stuff. So. But you might have to design a web page on using InDesign as sort of a way of roughing it out, working it out. In which case, you'd want to know that the type ought to be 16 point rather than think it's the default of 12 point and design something where the type is a lot smaller than it needs to be. Okay. Then what we're dealing with here now that we're dealing with blocks of text, is that we're also going to be dealing with something called leading, which is the distance from the baseline. So that's the baseline of one line of type and the baseline of the next line of type. And we use the baseline as to measure from because it's just more consistent and easier to deal with than, say, measuring from here to here, because this might be, say, a G that's rounded, and then this might be a P that's flat, and you have a hard time really being clear about what the measurement would be. Here are some examples of text. So 12 on 14, so this is about 120%, which is what the default is on your computers. This is a good space for body copy to start with. Some fonts are going to, because a lot of the measurements of fonts are relying on what the designer thought looked right. Sometimes you will get the default and it'll look too tight. Sometimes you'll get the default and it might look too loose, and you can adjust that. But 120%, the standard default leading in InDesign, is a pretty good place to start when you're setting body text. Here's an example of what's called negative leading, where the leading is actually a smaller number than the size of the type. And you can see how tight that type is. And though I don't think it actually, yeah. So like here, the descender on the Y and the ascender on the D, they actually crash into each other because the type's so close. Well, it depends on what you're designing. If you look at the work of David Carson, he will just take and make things like run all on top of each other. Generally, unless you're being artistic, you're generally not going to have the leading smaller than the point size of the type, just because you don't want the ascenders and the descenders crashing. But then I'm going to talk about headlines, and they're a little bit different. So, and then here, what they've done is open up and added additional leading in between each line. You can see that there's a lot more air. Probably the limit on adding leading is that it reaches a point where they read as individual lines and they don't read as a block of text. But that's up to you. You'll see leading like this oftentimes in something like poetry, because oftentimes they do want to make absolutely sure that you're reading each line in sort of a separate manner. Sometimes we'll do this if we have a lot of space to fill, if there's only a little bit of text, but there's a lot of a small amount of text in a large space, and then sometimes we'll add leading to make it, to just help fill space. So, and then if you squint at this a little bit, this is maybe not a perfect example, but if you squint at a block of type, it'll be sort of a specific color gray. And if you have something that's set really tight like this, or you have a bolder font, it'll be darker. That gray will be darker. If you have something like this, the gray will be lighter. That's called typographic color. And the typographic color can also be used as a way of, as a part of your design. Like, do you want your page to look light, or do you want to have your page look dark? Most of the time, I generally want my page to look light and kind of inviting. But sometimes you want something heavier and more menacing or what have you. And I'm just going to say, so optical leading, or rather the leading that's, okay, come on. So as I was saying, depending on how the type is designed, maybe how big the X height is, some fonts will appear to have less space between lines. Some type will have more space between line. And sometimes you're going to want to actually go in and adjust the leading on your text to make it look lighter or darker, because you're not happy with the choice of the font designer. Okay. Then one other thing is there's sort of an ideal length number of characters in a line for a type to be read easily, which is generally somewhere between 45 and 75 characters, with 66 characters being ideal. So this is probably too long. If you're working on your magazine design and you're running the text all the way across all 3 columns, that's probably a little bit too wide. It would be tiring to read the line all the way across, and then perhaps difficult to, particularly with the larger block of copy, to find where you started because it's such a long distance. This is more a good size. Probably a column and a half on your magazine spread would be sort of an ideal size. And then we have, and then these are kind of too short. And there's a couple of reasons. One, they're too short because you read the line and then you barely get in any words and you've got to jump back to the beginning. So that's a problem. But as a designer, if we set this type flush left and then keep the same amount of space between all the words, what'll happen on this side is that we'll get what's an extreme rag. This is called the rag, and it'll start like really curving back and forth because of the size of the words that you're dealing with. And it's also too short because if you justify it left and right, what happens is that the spaces that they have to use in order to space the words out start to have, and so that they all line up on both sides, because that's how they make it line up on both sides. They have space between the words. You start having rivers that start running through your text, and it's distracting. Doesn't look good. Okay. That was probably just way too much information, but all things to be looking at when you're working. So for instance, you set your text in your magazine design, and what you're seeing in just a standard column is a lot of rivers running through your text. Then it might be smart to make your type just a little bit smaller, maybe half a point smaller or a full point smaller, and just see if that clears up some of the breaks in the text. Okay. So how many didn't have any idea there was so much involved in just setting a little bit of text? So anyway. So just a hint when you're working on these magazine projects, Well, in fact, when you're working on design projects generally, and this is partially just because you're just starting to work in design, it's really smart to do a project and either just use one font family, like, you know, Helvetica and then Helvetica Bold and Helvetica Italic and so on like that. And so that, or maybe two contrasting families where you have a different different font for your headline and then a different font for your body copy, like using Impact for your headline and then using Garamond for your body copy. Or possibly, if you're stretching the limits, you could go to 3 contrasting families, but they need to be really super different, like a script font and a sans serif font and a serif font. What you don't want to do is be doing like 2 families that don't contrast, like 2 different versions of a serif font, or 2 different, I suppose you could do 2 different script fonts, but you don't really want to just be throwing in 20 different fonts just because that seems like it would be fun. It gets hard to deal with, it's hard to track how you're using it. And it just tends to look more amateurish. If you kind of keep things in a small range with lots of contrast between the different types, it's going to look better. So for instance, this would be an example. So the first one just uses a single font family. The second uses 2 contrasting font families. So usually this would be switched around and you'd use a sans serif for the heads and the subheads and then the serif for the body text. And then here's an example of what 3 contrasting families might look like. What you don't want it to look like is that you just accidentally picked the wrong font. You know, like if you had 2 different serif fonts, you don't want to make it look like you just picked the wrong font accidentally. You want to be, you really want to make it look like you were intentional about what you did. Questions? Yeah. And this slideshow, by the way, is available on the server in our class folder under references, or whatever I called that folder. Okay. So let me go with that. Well, and the other thing is that since you're working with a historical style, it'd be a good idea to try to figure out what fonts were available in that historical time period and use those in your magazine spread. As you might remember in the movie Helvetica, they said graphic designers can't go to historical movies because they always get the fonts wrong. So see if you can get your fonts to match up to your time period. Okay. So, all right. So, what else did I want to tell you about today? So, so this is the design I was working on in last class. I want to mention that I had used an Adobe, one of the Adobe font site fonts, and I could not get it to work this morning. So I found another font and reworked it. So a couple of things I want to mention as a graphic designer. Graphic designers like to play games. And one of the games that we play is how to line things up. So if you look here, I've lined up the top of this subhead with the top of my headline here with the ascender on the R. I lined this photo up. This photo ought to be lined up at the bottom of this text right here. This photo is lined up, or ought to be lined up, with the top of the ascenders on this line of text. These all line up with the grid. And then I'm actually lining up the baselines of the text across the columns. And you can do that by just clicking on this text box and moving it up and down relative to this one. If you have an instance where you have a break in the text, like you have a photo or a full quote or something, if you can take and pull the bottom of this box up here, you'll see the little blue box right here. You can click here and start here and create a new box there, which will be in the flow of the document. And then you can move this one around so it lines up if it doesn't. So here, so what I did was this. If I go, okay. So instead of using sometimes using text wrap, which is what I used on this, doesn't work. And it's really difficult to get this text to line up here because of it. I've got a text wrap operating in here. In that case, then I would take and drag this bottom of this box up here. I can click there, create a new text box here, and it'll be in the flow of the document. And then I can move it down until it lines up properly. So, okay. All right. Next. So my idea here was to try to pull the eye through this space and have it read things in proper order. So I have a great big headline up here. And then this is at the top and is fairly large. So likely my eye will go from there to there, start reading down. But you'll notice that I have this initial cap T, and that's there to try to draw my eye into the text also. First thing I'm going to do, well, let's see. And there's a control that allows you to do this. I mean, I could technically create a tiny little text box with a letter T in it and use the text wrap to get that to wrap like that. But in fact, if I go to paragraph control, down here at the bottom, there is under where it says ignore, there is a control for the number of lines deep that the first letter is. It's a drop cap number of lines. It's deceiving because for some bizarre reason, they decided to start it out with 0. And so clicking on it once, and that's still only 1 line deep. And so it doesn't make any difference. You have to get to at least 2 before it starts to show up. And then there's a control over to the right that actually would allow me to do several letters. And what I recommend is if you're doing a drop cap and you've got a different style headline, that I would then go you could do something like that. And if that space looks too small, the way to fix that is to go to your kerning control. Oh, come on. I'm not going to get in. There we go. So, like that. You can actually kern between the letter E and this first T, and it'll give you a little bit more space if that's what you want. So, does that make sense? Okay. Next. And I can drop that down. So I had a couple of rules over here called, it says, so what I've talked about already was line of text across the gutters. In other words, line of text up across here. But there's also one other thing. So this is called, let's see, that should be a widow, which is a single line down at the bottom. If you have something like that, it's always a good idea to make your text box a little bigger or to do something else so that you can have at least 2 lines at the bottom there. Or, huh?
Right, make it taller.
Yeah, if you can. It's just generally considered to be poor design to have a single line there all alone by itself. And if you have, in fact, it's also considered to be not so great to have a single line all on its own at the top of a column like that. And there's a bunch of different ways to deal with that. But usually there's some way, I mean, if necessary, if I select this whole paragraph, I could go to my tracking control. And oftentimes, if I tighten up the tracking just a little, it might get rid of that extra amount. Though I probably wouldn't go more than -10 on the tracking. Too much work. Okay, so just see what you can do. In this case, if I've got if I had an extra line down there, what I would probably do is I would probably adjust this full quote a little bit so that it came up like that. Generally, there's something in the column of text that you can adjust that'll allow you to fix it. And then I need to go back and line that up. Okay. Next. If you want to change the color of your page, you can pull a block like this, fill it full of color. Generally, I'll make sure you want to make sure you also turn off the stroke, and then object, arrange, send it back like that. Pull it out to the bleed. And then here I'd want to change that to white. And of course, you don't have to do the whole page. You could just decide that you want to do the color up to there or what have you. Or create another box and add another color, something like that. Okay. Then if your design isn't working out or you like this idea, but you want to play with something else, what I'd recommend is going File, Save As. Then I generally will add a V and a number. So create another version. And then now I still have my original version. And maybe I want to take that over there and take that there. And this will be a bad design, but I'm just, you know, and then maybe this once I want this to be down here and that to be there. You know, and so now I have a different design and I still have my old design in case I didn't like it. Okay. It's almost always a good idea to play around with several designs when you're working and see what comes up. Okay. Then let's see. Oh, right, I know one. And this, I need to remove my text wrap. That's why that was pushed in. See, here's an indication place. I've got this one little 3-letter hyphenated word going there. And so that's not so attractive. And so I might go back to my tracking and tighten it. And that causes it to pull up. Yeah. Then what I want you to work on also is that we need captions underneath these images. Okay. And there are lots of different ways to do captions. Let me give myself a little bit more space. Links. So you could just simply put a text box underneath here. I'm going to make this more or less match the rest of my type. So in this case, Futura medium, but I'm going to change it just a little, make it italic. And this is 9 point. And then Rodchenko. Okay. Okay. So that's one way to just put captions underneath. It's also possible, if your design doesn't let you do that, that you could also do something like save that. I'll save as version 4. Left. Here, right. So you could do something like that. In which case, you could do something like that. You can also if you have a piece of art, you think it would be better to put your caption on top. Save as. You could also do something like that. So in that case, it would do that. So you don't have to fill up every piece of space in your design. You don't, again, have to use all of your article. You don't have to use all of your photos. I would just try to make a nice design that you like. Okay. All right, and I'll talk about some more things about this tomorrow, but I'll let you work for a while and I'll be wandering around. And then last half hour of class, we'll talk about the midterm. Yep. Right. Well, it doesn't keep them. It'll let you use them for the class, but then you need to take that font, the font folder that you download, and place it on your flash drive or on the server or something so that you can get it later. Okay. I mean, you've downloaded and you've used a font, right? Well, let me see. Does it give you? So here's the. There it is. No, it's not right. Is it yellow? So double click on that. Start that. And click, check it. And install check. Okay, it's just telling me that we put some minor issues. But it should be okay. If you go to a download a font that doesn't install immediately, it'll give you a dialog box that'll say that there's some, there might be some problems with that font. If it doesn't say that there's huge problems with the font, usually you can install it and it will work. Just sometimes. But if you download a font, install it, it says there's something wrong with it, you override that and install it anyway, and you're trying to use it and InDesign is going crazy. It's probably a defective font and I would not use that font. I've had some weird problems where I wasn't able to print projects, and it usually ended up being that there was a faulty font in the system. Okay. Two more things that I forgot to mention. One is that, so there's a limited number of photos, or I'm sorry, a limited number of swatches that are built into this system. But if you have a photo, you can take this eyedropper that they have here in the toolbar. There's actually a regular eyedropper underneath, but there's a color theme tool on the top. If I click on the color theme tool and click on a photo, you'll see that it gives you some color options. If I click on the arrow to the right of those color options, it gives you even more options. And if I select one of these options, if I click here in this little grid, what it does is it then adds the colors that it picked from the photo into your palette. And then those are colors that are probably going to look good in your design because they already exist in one of your images. Okay. So, again, if I pick this image, I go to the eyedropper, the color theme eyedropper, and I click here. Gives me a bunch of colors. Click, and then I get another theme like that. And then I could use those in my design and it will probably be useful. Now, one other thing about using photos is that photos actually, or artwork, sometimes has a direction. Okay, I picked these images because they didn't have that much of a direction. But if I took this image, file, place, and I pick an image like this, so Which way is this image looking? Okay, it's looking to the right, right off the page. It's better to have an image in this case that looked this way, because it would then direct the eye back onto the page. So this one's going to tend to draw, you're going to look here, and then you might look there and you hit the yellow and you'd be right off the page. Let's see what else I have in here. That would be the same. This one, even though there are no eyes, tends to draw the eye more back into the page. If I took this image and I wanted to use this image, I might be better off taking this one and making it smaller. Moving it over there. And then I could take this image over here. Like that, and then it would draw the eye back onto the page. Does that make sense?
Can you take a picture, like you said, this, that when we converted them to 300 CPI, that we did that in Photoshop, and should we use those Photoshop documents?
Yes.
With pictures?
Yes.
So when we bring them, it'll probably be back to this, not that big page.
Right.
Okay, no, because I was just noticing that the ones.
Yeah, I was lazy and did not convert all of mine. So yeah, so if you want to use the PST files, not the JPEGs, for your project. Okay, studying for the midterm, you want to go to your course content. Somewhere under here. Ah, come on. Go to resources. I'm sorry, no. Go to presentations and vocabulary, like here. There is a list of design vocabulary. You can ignore, I would read over, but you can ignore the basic vocabulary of visual communication, which is framing, balance, figure, ground, pattern, point, line, shape, form, scale and emphasis, texture and perspective. You ought to all be familiar with those in some form, but they're not going to be on the test. What's going to be on the test is a little bit about color spaces. So visual hierarchy, or basic elements used in print design. You ought to be able to tell a symbol from a pictogram from an ideograph. You want to be able to practice picas and points. And we probably should spend another couple of minutes with that. So Okay. Uh, If I ask you to add 6 points and 3 points, what's that going to be? Okay, 9 points. If I 6 points plus 6 points, what else is it? Huh? 1 pica. It's also equal to 1 pica. Okay. And so what would this be? What's the process? Sorry? Well, now, so what are you supposed to do here first? Okay, and 11 and 12 is what? Okay. And then what's 3 and 4? Okay. And how can we reduce this? Well, 23 divided by 12. Right. Actually, you're right. So it'd actually be 8E11. Okay. How many people are staring at me like they're about to die? Right? Yeah. Okay. Let's try another one. So what would that be? Huh? So 38 and 38. And then what's 38 divided by 12? 3 remainder of 2. So this would be 3 remainder 36. 3 remainder of 2. And so how would this, what would that make this? Louder. So 41P2. Like that. Does that make sense? Anybody it doesn't make sense to? Okay. All right. And the reason I talk about this at all is what can happen is you've got a column of type, and this is all on 12 points of lead like that. And you can decide that you want to have a subhead in here, which is maybe 14 point. So maybe too large to use a 12 point, lead. I'm not asking you to do this. I'm saying that in the future, you'll run into this. And so you've got to figure out, what leading are you going to put this on? And then how much space do you want there? How much space do you want there for it all to work out and keep lined up properly? So it's just useful to be able to add and subtract picas and points. Mostly you probably won't have to ever multiply them. Okay. Let's see. If I'm talking about kerning or tracking or leading, you want to know what those are. Okay. If there is a text that's being used for body text, it's generally simpler. If you are using display text, oftentimes it will be more complex. Okay. Headline fonts can be simple, but they can also be super exaggerated and super funky because they're bigger and you can still read them. While if you take those headline fonts and you make them really small, they become pretty illegible. I gave you some standard default font sizes for business cards, magazines, PDFs, and websites. I would memorize that. Font structure is, we have this is particularly important if you're designing a font, but this is the center line, baseline, excite, and center line. It might also be the cap height. But sometimes these are a little different. Sometimes your race center will actually be a little taller than your cap height. Okay, what else? There are some parts of letters. If you click here on the PDF, here are some parts of letters. More specifically, what will be on the test will probably be the ascender, the bold, bracket, counter, descender, stem, and serif. Okay. And I would look carefully at, so if you go up here, the intro to typography slideshow I've been showing you is listed. I would download it and I would look, come on. I would look at the history of types of type styles. because I'll be talking about, I'll give you some sample types and I'll say, can you identify which category they come from? I have to figure out how to get back here. Oh, right there. Okay. And then finally, there are design terms for the different parts of the magazine spread that we're working on. Okay, so what's this called? Okay. Okay, what's the space all the way around here called? Let's see. What's the space between the columns called? Okay. Also called an alley. What are these? Have I talked about this? I mean, not. Okay, these are called trim marks, and they indicate to the printer where this magazine is going to be trimmed out. So these are trim marks. Okay, and then what is this line that's outside this edge of the page called? The line that's outside the edge of the page. Very good. Lead. That's where we bring artwork. If it's going to go to the edge of the page, it has to extend out to the lead. And then this set of boxes here, if we're talking about all the boxes in conjunction, that would be the grid. Okay. Makes sense? All right. And that should cover. That should cover everything. So page numbers, which we'll talk about next class, are generally also referred to as folios. So I would look over at like the first half of the intro to typography slideshow. And I'd look over this vocabulary. And that will be what's on the midterm. Okay. All right. Questions? Thoughts? The midterm is a wide variety of different things. Some of it's memorization, some of it's multiple choice, some of it's fill in the blank. Okay. Okay. All right.